Good afternoon and welcome to the Address Cleansing for Payroll webcast. I'm Tony and I will be facilitating today's session. Today's presenters are Vince Marasco, Dan Regan, and Mark Thompson. Before we begin, I'd like to just make some quick announcements. Note the audio options available to you in your invitation. You can listen through your computer or your telephone. If you prefer to use your telephone audio, please review your invitation or the webinar login screen for dial-in details. While viewing the webcast, note the full screen button available in the upper right. This button toggles to a full screen view of the presentation. It provides a better view, but just note that you won't see the other pods such as the Q&A at the bottom in the full screen view. But you can always toggle back and forth from full screen. We will offer a PDF of today's presentation at the conclusion of the webcast. This file is provided just for future reference. Today's webcast is being recorded and we will not be opening the phone lines for questions. If you do have questions during the presentation, simply enter them into the Q&A pod at the bottom and press enter. But please note we may not be able to respond to all questions until the end of the presentation, or we can follow up with an email. So that concludes today's announcements. Let's go ahead and get started. I will now turn it over to the first presenter, Vince.
Hi, Tony. Thank you very much. And first, I'd like to thank everybody who has joined this webcast today. I know that everyone is very busy, and we really appreciate that you're willing to carve out some time for us. As Tony mentioned, my name is Vince Marasco. I'm a senior product manager at Vertex. I've been with Vertex for 4 years, and I've had several years of product management experience in other industries. First, before we get too deep into this webcast, I'd like to just do a quick level setting. For the most part today, we're making the assumption that almost everyone on this webcast is an EBS user, or you at the very least have a general interest in how address cleansing works for payroll. So keep that in mind as we move through these slides, and we'll be happy to address any questions around that at the end of the presentation. So from a payroll perspective, there are some real challenges in determining the right jurisdiction to assign your employees to. There's a lot of facets to doing that. You need to understand where employees work, where they live, the taxing jurisdictions that are appropriate to apply to those locations. And the real challenge is trying to get that information in the right way from your employees. You know, oftentimes they'll give you an invalid address or an address that's spelled a little incorrectly, or even an address that they think is the right address to give you for the purpose of determining taxes, and it just isn't. The other aspect of really getting to the right taxing jurisdiction for employees comes down to zip codes. When an employee gives you their address, they're giving you a 5-digit zip code. And frankly, I can understand why. If anybody asked me what my 9-digit zip code was, I wouldn't be able to give that to them. And getting that 9-digit zip code becomes a real challenge in a lot of situations. And then from a payroll perspective, just a valid address isn't quite enough. You need a lot of ancillary information like political subdivision codes, and if you're in Pennsylvania, you need school district codes. And getting that piece of information is even harder than getting a 9-digit zip code. So when we really try to look at where these jurisdictional challenges are, it's everywhere, and it's really derived mostly from trying to get the additional metadata you need about an employee address appended to the employee address. So, we've all been there where we've misidentified the appropriate place to tax an employee, and when that happens, there really are some serious ramifications. At a high level, you could be calculating their taxes incorrectly. But at a more detailed or granular level, we could be applying incorrect reciprocity agreements if we haven't identified the jurisdictions correctly. The employees could get hit with a filing time tax bill at the end of the year when, they thought taxes were being calculated correctly all year long, and it turns out they weren't. And then there's going to invariably be the unpleasant discussion that the employee has with HR when the taxes weren't being calculated correctly on the paycheck. And that's no fun from anybody in payroll or HR, and it's definitely not a good use of anyone's time in that department. I can tell you firsthand that HR and payroll professionals are extremely overworked, and they're tasked with a significant number of mission-critical projects for a company. So there's absolutely no reason that they should be spending a significant chunk of their time trying to dig through those issues. You know, when we were putting this slide deck together, we were looking for kind of a funny slide that illustrated a lot of how people probably feel about problems with their paycheck. And I think this really captured the spirit of that correctly. You know, the issues that people have calculating paychecks correctly, they really start at the core of making sure that you've identified the correct taxing jurisdictions properly. And that is a multifaceted process. And the reason it's so hard is because employee details change consistently. You know, the amount that you're paying employees could change from week to week. You know, where an employee lives and works can change all the time. You know, the jurisdiction that we're calculating taxes in for an employee can change from time to time. So to appropriately calculate the correct paycheck requires vigilance in terms of ensuring that you've done that base work properly, of ensuring that the employees are assigned to the correct taxing jurisdictions. And all kidding aside, I know this is a funny picture, but that's not an easy task. It's one of the reasons that payroll is one of the most complex taxing areas in the entire taxing industry. So one of the things that we commonly get when we talk about address cleansing solutions for payroll is really how does it work? So in this case, we're going to be looking at the EBS integration into payroll. You'll see that EBS and the Oracle team, they've built a direct integration into our cloud address cleansing service. And this is really nice. It means that there's no additional software to deploy within your EBS instance because all of the address cleansing software sits in our cloud. And what happens is Oracle will actually pull the employee work and resident details out of their database and send that as a web message to our cloud service. And that's done in real time. So once our system receives that employee work and resident location detail, it will actually cleanse the address, find out if there were any problems with it. If there were any problems with it, it'll correct it, such as a misspelling or an incorrect zip code. And what it will then do is it will resolve it to USPS standards, reformat it, correct it of any inaccurate data, and return that corrected address back to EBS. But the one thing that we don't want to lose sight of is not only does it straighten out address problems, which is great because employees from time to time do make mistakes when they're typing in their address on the various forms they fill out. But what it also does is it gets you all those ancillary details that are needed to handle an appropriate payroll tax calculation. So it's going to get you their county information. It's going to find out what the exact Vertex geocode is that they need to be assigned to. It's going to identify what their school district is, which is key for Pennsylvania tax calc. It's also going to pull out their political subdivision code and bring all of that additional information back with the employee record. And that is hard to find in a lot of cases. You can't go to one place and get all of those details. So having this automatically appended to the employee record not only cuts down on time spent by HR, but it also really minimizes chances of identifying the incorrect taxing details for a particular employee. So once our service has identified all of that information, it wraps it back up into a web message and sends it back to EBS where the employee record is updated with that information. So it's a very nice process, leverages cloud-based software, so you don't really have to worry about taking any new deployments on-premise, and then handles the cleansing and correction and appending of additional address data to the employee record. So there is a lot of really nice features about our address cleansing solution for payroll. For one, it works with any US-based employee address. So you don't have to worry about whether or not they're in a tiny town in Louisiana or they're in one of the most complex school districts in Pennsylvania or Kentucky. This will actually identify the appropriate address details and correct them for those employees. We've done a full integration into, I shouldn't say we, the EBS team has done a really nice and full integration into EBS so that there's no additional software that you have to worry about deploying. This is really designed to automate the jurisdictions for both the employee work and resident locations so that no matter what address you're dealing with as it relates to the employee, you're able to effectively identify their tax jurisdiction. This is also really nice in the sense that it will manage the employee's taxation address for you in situations where the taxing address is different than the mailing address. And what you're a couple key takeaways in terms of what you're really going to get out of this system. One, it's a corrected address that's fully standardized to USPS standards. It's a full 9-digit zip code. You'll get a political subdivision code, a school district code when it's appropriate, such as in Pennsylvania, as well as a Vertex geocode, all through the address cleansing solution. So I mentioned earlier that the Oracle team did a really nice job of integrating this into EBS, and it is actually fully integrated into both the employee self-service and the professional address forms modules within EBS. And it really works in a very nice, streamlined process for your organization. I think, one of the things that we looked at was, this really shouldn't add a lot of overhead or burden to how your team manages EBS and addresses. So this really works in tandem with your business process. So when an employee enters a new address or updates an existing address in self-service, it automatically performs a validation on the address entered. And lets you know whether or not it's in line with the standards that you're trying to use. When a professional user queries or updates a particular employee address, it also validates it. And then already validated addresses aren't revalidated, and that's a huge time saver. So you don't have to worry about, hey, I just cleansed this address last week, why is it trying to do it again? There's also a batch process that can be run to cleanse all of the employee addresses in batch, and it will validate all of the addresses that haven't already been cleansed. So there's a real multifaceted approach to dealing with address cleansing within the EBS environment. So here's actually a screenshot showing some of the automated validation that occurs. You'll see that employees and administrators can choose to accept, review, or ignore any of the recommended changes from address cleansing. And this is really key because no one's trying to force anything on you. You have the option to accept the proposed results. And that's a really important feature of how address cleansing works. The other thing that I wanted to call out in particular is the address cleansing when it's being utilized to determine a taxing address. So this is really, really useful in situations where the taxing jurisdiction is different from the employee's mailing address. And one of the things that we really focus on here is that it's automatically integrated into the employee record. So you don't have to copy and paste it anywhere, worrying about remembering to look it up from a spreadsheet and move it back into EBS. Because of this tight integration with address cleansing, it's able to automatically pull those details back into the EBS employee record. And last but not least, in terms of the integration points, is the batch validation. And this is really a very useful solution for organizations that are either really high turnover or who are just coming on board with the address cleansing solution, because you can run it for all of your addresses or only the addresses that haven't been already validated. So it really plays itself well to both high turnover environments and just organizations that want to do a routine cleansing of the employee addresses, like in ramp up for the W-2 mailings or things along those lines. And one of the things I don't want to lose sight of with the address cleansing solution that we have for payroll is the lack of need to install additional software on premise. So you really don't need any additional software for this solution. Basically, there will be a contract that you have to sign with Vertex, and once you sign up for it, you'll receive a username and a password. Those credentials get integrated into EBS as part of the address cleansing configuration. And when you look at this in comparison to other solutions that are out there, this is really a non-invasive way of starting to leverage address cleansing to power the payroll process, chiefly because there really isn't extra software that gets deployed or injected into Oracle. And with that, I would actually like to turn it back over to Tony for the Q&A process.
All right, thanks, Vince. We did get a couple questions that came through here, so I'll just go through them in the order that they came in. First question is this service the same address cleansing around invoicing, accounts receivable, and accounts payable, or is this something different?
Right, Vince, so I'll talk to that one a little bit. This is kind of a common misconception. Hopefully everybody who's listening to this understands. So Vertex does use geocodes in the accounts receivable and accounts payable products that we sell, like the O-Series product and Q-Series. So some developers may be very, the geocodes may look awfully familiar. The payroll geocode is a different file, and we're actually leveraging the payroll tax product itself and an address cleansing service to provide this. So it's this combination that makes this a very unique offering, and EBS is actually one of the first groups to take advantage of it. So two different camps, right? One is associated with accounts receivable and accounts payable, where you may be validating where your vendors are, or you're invoicing through AR, and this has nothing to do with it. This is modeled for people that have mostly employees in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana. They may be retailers that have high turnover, doing weekly pay, but we really feel like this service is going to be leveraged around W-2 and W-4 time, where people will run their entire employee base against this to clean things up before things go out. So, good question, but different side of the application.
All right, thanks, Dan. Another question came in here. What does your address cleansing application do that your standard geocoder doesn't?
I think I'll take that one, Tony. So the geocoder is a way of converting a city, state, and zip combination into a geocode that you would use for jurisdictional assignment. Our address cleansing solution actually takes a full street level address and utilizes that information to convert it to a geocode. And it's a much more accurate way of getting to a specific Vertex geocode. And in addition to the fact that we can use an actual street level address for it, it also returns the ancillary payroll details like PSD code and school district code as part of the results.
Okay, thanks, Vince. A couple more questions here. We are doing good on time. So the next question is, does anything need to reside on-premise from Vertex to deliver this service or not?
So the short answer is no. Oracle did a great job of providing this functionality in a roll-up patch this past May. So as long as you have that installed, all you really need is a username and password that's provided by Vertex when you sign the agreement, and then you would just go through the configuration steps that Oracle provides, and you're all set.
Okay, and we have one final question here. We'll throw it over to Dan.
Right, so there's a question about would the school district automatically be added to the employee's record? So, like Vince said during the presentation, this information, and this was asked, we were at one of the Oracle shows earlier this year, and this seemed to be kind of a hot button. Nothing that we bring back has to be applied automatically. We automate this information, we bring it back to users, but Oracle's built some tools where you can either accept the information that comes back or not. So especially for the HR professional who's worried about this type of information, the power is still in your hands when you use Oracle EBS as to what information resides within your application. So I hope that helps.
Okay. Thank you, Vince, Dan, and Mark. That will conclude today's webcast presentation. And as a final thank you for participating, here is the presentation available for download. Thank you again, and have a nice day.